Hi, Jake. Nice to talk to you.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
I was impressed with the film. I watched it a couple of days ago. It was interesting because it sort of caught me off guard at first, because it has a real like documentary kind of vibe to it. But then after getting into the film a little bit, I realized that this was sort of not a full documentary, maybe kind of like blurring the lines a little bit. And I thought that was a pretty interesting. Why don't we start with just tell us a little bit about the film?
Sure. So After America was made in 2000, well, it kind of started 2018, but really was made in 2019-20 with a kind of diverse group of a bunch of people based in the Twin Cities of Minneapolis, St. Paul. And what I did is I kind of just did an open call to anyone who'd be interested. And I met with kind of auditioned, but my auditions were like sitting and kind of having coffee for 15, 20 minutes.
Right.
I ended up meeting a few hundred people. So kind of somewhere between like, I think 400 and 500, somewhere in there, folks over many months, and then whittled that down to 7 that comes from really kind of varied backgrounds.
Wow.
And then with them, 2 of which were criminal justice de-escalation improv workers. There's a bullwhip expert who's been for decades has been traveling the country doing rodeos and S&M conventions. There's a
Right.
young deaf model, queer model. There's a poet and playwright and educator who's originally from Somalia, and a few other folks. And so what I did is we kind of did this workshop process. So I worked with them for about 6 weeks to kind of explore themes in their lives, kind of see kind of what was bubbling under the surface for them. Like what were the things that they felt they didn't have a space or an avenue to kind of let out, to talk about, to discuss, to kind of feel. And then from there, went straight into filming. And so the result was kind of somewhere between, it feels like a doc, like you're right, but it's kind of somewhere between truth and fiction. It follows these folks as they're trying to kind of, I like to say, escape the American dream, kind
Right.
of get out from under those pressures that I think so many of us feel, these ideas of what we're supposed to be, that we sometimes even put on ourselves, and kind of let what's bubbling underneath burst to the surface in a way that's hopefully sort of cathartic and healthy. And so the film itself begins with Teresa, who's one of the de-escalation workers, and she, during one of the sessions, some things in her own life kind of bubble to the surface in unexpected ways, and she returns to her suburban life, trashes it all, and kind of wanders off into the frozen tundra winter, and ends up breaking into an abandoned mall and squatting there in one of the empty storefronts. And so from there, her story begins to kind of cross over to everyone else's. And we kind of see this kind of motley crew of folks kind of living on the edges and margins of Minneapolis who are trying to escape America, basically.
Yeah, that was actually one of the most interesting things about the film for me, was just sort of, it's sort of reflecting back to me kind of these things that I like. Well, I'm not in the same specific situations, but like echoing back these feelings that, like, of like sort of not being in the place you're supposed to be, or not like David Byrne says in Once in a Lifetime, like, how did I get here? You know what I mean? And that was it was a really interesting experience, sort of seeing myself kind of reflected back in many ways, like in watching what these people are going through. So you didn't really have like an idea of what the film was going to be about going into it. You just kind of wanted to sort of talk to these people, see what was going on, and then kind of explore that.
Yeah. So I had been spending about 5 years in LA, going back and forth, but predominantly from Minneapolis to LA, but predominantly, and I was really kind of in the belly of the beast.
Mhm.
And I come from a real kind of like fine arts and independent film background.
Right.
And so being in the belly of Hollywood and seeing how films were still being made like it was the 1930s, and seeing how
Yeah.
much was sort of like everything kind of centered on anything but the actual human connection we're supposed to have when we're performing.
Mhm.
It's something I feel like we see more when it's in live performance, whether it's like music or plays or performance art, but it kind of gets lost in the process of making films. And I was really thinking about like, well, how do we get back to that we lost? And there's definitely, I'm not the first, there's definitely lots of other filmmakers that use kind of a workshop process like me, like the Italian neorealists, Mike Lee,
Mhm.
Sean Baker more recently. And I think all of us kind of have our own way of approaching this. And so what I decided was like, I want to turn my back on everything I was ever taught for how to make movies, all the
Right.
like ways we think about it, because the technology for making films is so different. And we've talked about this like democratization of filmmaking production and distribution, but I feel like we're still sort of in these baby steps of how can we use it in different ways.
Right.
I see, we use these digital cameras, which are easier than ever goddamn before to like
Yeah.
shoot with. You don't need lights like you did. You don't have to like when you start filming, you're not worrying about the film stock going through. It's like so much easier. It's so
Yeah.
much cheaper. But then we still film movies like we're shooting in the golden age of Hollywood with 35 millimeter
Mhm.
cameras. And so I wanted to kind of just jump away from it and like let go of all the things we take that we think this is the proper way of doing it, and
Mhm.
just trust the instincts and trust the actual human connections. So in some ways, I think that's why it feels so much more like a doc, is because we were just a small group of people in a room seeing what would happen and just kind of jumping in and going with the flow.
Yeah.
Which is very against how you're supposed to make movies, but it was kind of like a thrill to kind of to buck tradition and just kind of see
Right.
where it led us.
Well, and the emotion, I don't know, like the emotion that's expressed in the film feels very genuine because it is. And you obviously weren't using, quote unquote, professional actors. And so I thought that, it was, you were not only able to draw this or not draw it out of or let them put it out there, but just it comes across as like so real, like it draws you in that kind of documentary style, but it's not. So for the actors, if it was like the Twin Cities, I gotta believe that there's not a ton of film being produced up there. So when you put out the casting call and you got all these people in, how did you, I imagine tons of people must have turned out, like how did you whittle that down to those individuals that you picked? Was it just was it the ones that had like just sort of the most provocative stories or the most kind of out there, or how did you select the ones you ended up going with?
Well, Minneapolis has a pretty decent, I would say, film community in film
Okay.
production. A lot of it's independent. There's some commercial work, and every once in a blue moon, or like maybe once, twice a year, a feature from somewhere else comes through. Usually because they want to film in snow.
Right.
but um, but there's definitely been, since at least like the 1960s, a really kind of thriving and strong independent film scene. And then the other bit is actually the Twin Cities is one of the biggest theater markets in the country.
Okay.
We're always in the top 3. Sometimes we even bop LA out of the number 2 spot. And so there's this really deep tradition of performing arts here.
Okay.
And
This has been
so
spoiled for choice then.
yeah, so it's nice because this idea of workshopping, this idea of working this way is just much more common and has a bigger history in theater. So maybe not everybody I met with knew it, but a lot did. And it's also this kind of like secret history of the Twin Cities that were one of the biggest centers for education of workshop theater. And so when I started thinking about like, how do I remake films and make a film in a different way, and I was thinking about things like kind of building up my own process, kind of towards the end of putting it together, I look back and I was like, oh, I did a lot of workshop stuff when I was in like 3rd grade. Like
Right.
our theater classes, and like it's one of these things we're realizing like, oh, not everyone did this. Not everyone like came up with your own plays as like a class when you're in like 3rd and 4th grade and like
Yeah.
did all these kind of things. So there's this kind of tradition around. Um, and so that I think kind of helped get people a bit used to the idea, but I had to explain to them this will be a very different way of filming. Like some days it'll feel like we're kids with a camera, some days it'll feel and like we're shooting a doc, some days it'll feel like we're shooting like reality TV, in the sense that it'll be like you have the idea of like the scenario, but we'll just see what happens. And then some days might feel more like a traditional film where like there's lights and like a few more crew members and stuff.
Right.
And so it really kind of moved along all those different models as we filmed, kind of day to day, scenario to scenario. And when I met with all the folks, I kind of gave them the heads up what I knew. And then really it was just personality. Like to be honest, like I really just kind of went off instinct. And what I tried to do as much as I could is with the entire process of making this film is just like let go of everything I know. Don't rely on what you've done before and just let your instincts guide you. And just let whatever you're feeling come out and guide you. And it was the same for me as it was for all the actors and the crew as well.
Okay. Well, I was curious, how much of the the finished film did you discover in editing? Because I got the impression that you probably, you know, let the cameras roll for, you know, much longer than what we saw, obviously. And just from my own meager experience, I know sometimes with documentary in particular, sometimes like you don't exactly know what you're fully doing until you're in the editing room. So I was curious, how much of this did you actually discover in editing, or was it that you really knew up front what you were going for and it was just a matter of cutting when you got to that point?
It was a mix. I mean, I ended up with 90 some hours of footage, so it took a while to whittle it down to 2.
Yeah.
But there aren't that many like big like scenes that got cut. I think if anything, it was sort of like shaping it, cutting it down, trimming, tightening. And it was a mix. Some days, I think I had a very clear idea of the scenario and was like, okay, like some basic idea, this will happen, go. Some it was a little more tighter, some was more looser. And then we just kind of let and saw what happened come through. And then it was shaping. And then there were some scenes I was just like, at the end of the day, I was like, oh, I bet there's a scene in there somewhere. I have no idea. Hope so. I'm gonna try not to stress out about it.
Right.
And then in the edit, finding stuff. But there were, I mean, every time I think we stepped into a place and started shooting, I really had no idea what was going to happen. So that kind of let the performances and let just what happened in the moment dictate and guide us. But there was kind of a loose structure underneath it. So I had like some idea of what might happen and certain sort of like maybe major points of where I thought would happen. Like I knew Teresa was going to trash her house and go off.
Right.
But what happened in that workshop, I didn't know what was going to happen.
Right.
And the discussions characters would have with each other, I didn't know. And like Eli, who plays Wayne, and Brooke, who plays Margaret, his mom, like they're real mother and son in real life. And so a lot of their discussion, I just be like, okay, you're going to, you know, go through the house.
Right.
And see what needs to be fixed. But then just their personalities and like, Brooke's a scene stealer, and just the stuff she'd say and the things that would happen, I would just kind of like follow along and see and kind of take the nuggets I could.
Right. That's got to be kind of the not knowing what's going to happen. That's got to be simultaneously liberating and frightening, I would imagine. Like because film, usually everything's got to be so meticulously planned out and, you know, scripted and storyboarded and all that stuff. So I imagine it was a bit emotionally a mixed bag.
It was actually kind of great. I have to admit. I don't know, maybe there's like a sixth sense of me, but there was a part where I was like, whatever, let's just see what happens. Like it relieved a lot of the stress I think that happens in film production where you're like, we have to get all these shots and this has to happen. We only have so many resources and we have to do this and we have to do that. And so it was sort of like a breath of fresh air to be like, well, let's just see what happens. Like I trust all of you guys, you know, hopefully you trust me and we'll just go with it. And, you know, it was kind of a real joy. I have to admit, even more so than I'd expect. I thought it would be fun, but it was kind of even more kind of enriching and enjoyable than I could have expected.
Well, it shows in the finished product. It's really a compelling film. Before I let you go, is there anything in particular you would like viewers to take away from this film following its conclusion, or is it kind of just take what it means to you from it?
I mean, I think I would hope everyone kind of takes what it means to allows themselves to kind of discover their own personal response to it. But I would hope and kind of encourage folks too to remember that there's always an alternative.
Right.
You know, there's always there's always another option out there. There's always another way of doing things, and I think that's kind of what's baked into every piece of this film. How we made it, the kind of final form of it, and sort of the plot, and hopefully also the takeaway is that there's always another option.
Yeah, well, and the film concludes in a very sort of affirmative way to sort of like, you know, because there's been this sort of a lot of like despair and anguish and stuff, but, you know, it still ends up in the end, you know, sort of being almost a positive take on stuff. So that was really neat. Well, okay, I think we're about out of time. But thank you for talking to me, and I look forward to turning other people on to this film as soon as there's distribution and I can put it in front of them.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for having me. It was a joy talking to you.
Likewise.